And as I said at our Wednesday night meeting last week, I thought the public discussion at the meeting last Tuesday on both sides was very helpful. It was exactly what I had hoped for in us opening this up to public discussion and having a public dialogue and debate on this. And one of the values of having the process be more transparent than it had been to date is you get more eyeballs on an issue, and as we've seen in any number of the capital programs that we've done, the more eyes and minds you get on an issue, the more areas you see that you need to kind of work on to improve. And there were several things brought up last week that I did not feel like we had done a good enough job of working on, and so we've spent the last week working on that, and I want to go over those with you. Is Nick down in the bullpen over there?
Yes, sir.
Okay, would you put the presentation up on the, thank you. So this will not be I'm talking right into it. How's that? Better? Okay. And I don't know, does anybody over there control the volume on this stuff in the room?
She's working on it, Mayor.
Fantastic. So I'm going to walk through this. This will not take long, but I just want to go over these things with you all. If you could go to the next slide, please. One of the items that people fairly raise is, what kinds of protections are there in place relative to this development? And it's important to note that really there's 4 different layers of protection relative to this proposal. You have your basic, if we could go to the next slide, please. Well, so you've got your basic protections, your zoning and your PUD protections, then you have the river design overlay restrictions, and then we have the restriction agreement that's in the contract, the details of which are in the resolution that the council is being asked to vote on. If we go to the next slide. So your basic zoning and your PUD restrictions dictate what can be done relative to this site, relative to the underlying zoning. And then, as I mentioned, we also have the river design overlay. And since the council's passage of that, the developer has made concessions and agreed to change their development that bring it more than 90% into compliance with the RDO restrictions compared to what they had initially proposed, something that is not necessary because this piece of property is grandfathered in because it had been acquired before the RDO was created. Could we go to the next slide, please? We'll deal with this one in a little more detail here in a moment. Next slide, please. This gives you a good idea of just the development or the space that we're talking about here. And in particular, I heard from a number of folks in the last week who had concerns about what happens to the connectivity of the trail going along the river parks there and along the river. And so you can see probably a little better on the shot on the right. The area that is outlined in yellow there is the subject tract, and you can see the trail there is between the area that is under consideration and the river channel. The trail is not part of the sale and would not be impacted by the sale. Go to the next slide, please. This does, I think, a decent job of putting into perspective what we're talking about as it relates to this proposal and how it relates to the rest of the park. And so you can see there we're talking about the northern 8.8 acres. You do have an apartment complex that's in the southern end of the park. The park kind of curves around it there. But the idea here being that, as we've talked about, the proceeds that we would generate from the sale of this northern end would go to the benefit of the vast majority of the rest of the park. Go to the next slide, please. This is the original drawing site plan for this development that was presented. As I've told you all before, back when I was a counselor, I actually was opposed to this because I did not think that it related to the river. It backed up to the river. The service entrance goes back by the river. The parking lot was just one large swath. There's virtually no landscaping in that. And so what we worked with them to change, if we can go to the next slide, next slide, please. This is the difference. So obviously you're talking about the same number of buildings. That has not changed. The key things that have changed here are the orientation of the buildings to the river. You can see there the two buildings, their service entrances have been moved together with a service court there that would be cloaked by landscaping. You have a significant tree planting throughout the area. You have trails that would connect throughout that development. You have berms along 71st and along Riverside Drive. So you'd still be able to see the buildings, no question about that, but it would help to cloak the parking itself from people that are driving by. And then you also have much greater connectivity and interaction between the trail itself there along the river and the development. Next slide, please. This is just a good rendering. You can see what it would look like. Better pictures than just seeing it from an aerial view. This is on the ground what the development would look like. Next slide, please. This is a view of 71st and Riverside Drive. You can see the berms there. You can see the landscaping. Landscaping, again, being done by Howland Van Kuren that's here in Tulsa, that's done a lot of other notable projects, certainly not the least of which would be Philbrook and Crystal Bridges. Next slide, please. That just gives you a better idea of the landscaping work on that berm there at the corner of 71st and Riverside. Next slide. Next slide. This gives you an idea of originally there was not transparency facing the river. That was one of the things I did not like. I didn't want to have some building just backing up to the river and to the trail so that people are using the trail or just driving by the back of a building. This actually provides windows from the building out to the trail. Next slide. And then we talked a lot about, and I thought a lot of folks brought up great points on the restrictions that would be needed to protect the property. And in particular, a lot of folks asked about whether or not, why couldn't we just lease the property rather than sell it? And of course, you know, from the park standpoint, there's a difference there because we get over $1.5 million to invest in the park as a result of a sale. But I think that one of the things that people are trying to accomplish through a lease is protecting how that land is used. And if we can accomplish the same goal with a different approach, we wanted to try and look into that, and I think we've managed to do that. The restriction agreement requires that the property be developed in compliance with the concept plans and the list of features. So the exhibit that you have with the resolution that lists the features that need to be there, the plans that you have, it has to be developed in compliance with that. Another thing that I thought Councilor America raised last week that was a very good point is who approves the landscaping plan for this? Do we just take their word that, you know, whatever happens to appear on these drawings is exactly where trees will be planted? I don't think that we should just assume that. And so the landscaping plans would, first, they would have to be submitted to the Planning Commission and their staff for approval. And any amendment, well, all of that needs to be done prior to closing. Those have to be approved prior to closing. Any change in the, any even improvements to the facilities, any proposed changes in use, any changes in the buildings, one, it has to be in full compliance with the RDO, but more importantly, we wanted to have because I think, again, that the goal people were trying to get with the lease is for the public and the city to be able to have a say in any change that would occur. And so this last bullet point you see here is probably the most important thing on this item, which is any amendments in the uses, the building space, or the concept plan would require a public hearing before the city council and a vote of approval by the city council. Next slide, please. The contract now clearly indicates that only REI will be the tenant of the facility. There have been some question about whether or not that could occur. There's a list of qualities there that are specific to where REI is the only company that fits the requirements of the tenant of that facility. The initial lease has to be for at least 10 years with 2 5-year options for a total of 20 years. And the TPFA has to review and approve the contract. As you see on item 3 there, again, as I mentioned a moment ago, the final approval of the landscaping plan has to occur. And also, as we discussed last week, there was concern about having a traffic plan done. The developer will pay for the traffic study that the city had actually waived requiring of them previously. And if that traffic study indicates, as I think many of us would expect it will, that there be a light or some other means of ingress and egress at the southernmost entrance, that they will accommodate that. Next slide, please. Another thing that was, I think, a very fair concern people had is what if they close on this and they sell it 2 minutes after closing, or 2 years or 20 years. The provisions of the restriction agreement will carry forward with the property in perpetuity and can only be amended by a vote of the city council. So it doesn't matter who owns this property. Anyone that owns this property will have the same restrictions in place that I've outlined so far. And again, the property will be in more than 90% compliance with the river design overlay, and any changes in the future must be in 100% compliance with it. Next slide, please. As we've discussed, the full purchase price will be dedicated to the park improvements. That was made very clear in the letter that Mr. Helmerich sent to the city of Tulsa when funds were donated for the acquisition of this. I mean, Mr. Helmerich was very succinct in his letter, so I will quote it in its entirety. This contribution of $1 million from the Helmerich Foundation is given to the city of Tulsa for the acquisition of park property only. Should any of this 67 acres be disposed of, the city will apply 100% of the proceeds to additional facilities or improvements on the remaining property. And that's the letter in its entirety signed by Mr. Helmerich in 1991. We would, I take very seriously the belief that we should honor that. As was referenced at the previous meeting, I knew Mr. Helmerich. That was one of the great thrills for me in getting to be a city councilor, was getting to know him on a more personal basis. That's the letter up there on the screen. And I have just so much respect for what he did for our community and for decades on our park board. And I would never support something if I thought that Mr. Helmerich was opposed to it. And I think his letter is pretty black and white about what his intentions were for the future of this park. Another issue, if we could go back to the slide, please, that came up was concern about what happens with the volleyball courts. The closing date has actually been adjusted so that it would occur after the volleyball season is over, at the end of the summer. And the council's resolution now states that the volleyball courts would be placed as the first improvements to be funded for the park. Next Last slide, please. As we've talked about, the public infrastructure development agreement that we have, the council's being asked to vote on tonight, limits the expenditure to $570,000 of public infrastructure to be utilized. This is, utilities, things like that would go into this property. And then one thing that we added based on, I think, fair concerns that people raised last week is a clawback provision. So if the developer fails to meet the construction terms that are in the restriction agreement and execute on the REI lease, that they will reimburse the city for the full cost of the public infrastructure improvements that have been made. So the public infrastructure obviously would still be in place there, but the developer would be on the hook for paying the city back for them. So, Madam Chair, this is what I've tried to do both in leading up to last week and in the last week is listen to folks that have concerns about this and to see if there's a way for us to take what was not a good agreement and revise it into something that is a good agreement. And, I believe that we've done that, both from visiting with folks that are plaintiffs in the lawsuit, folks that are users of that park, members of the city council, city officials, and then last week, really getting, I thought, a lot of good feedback from that meeting. And so, I'm happy to answer any questions that the council has, or if we want to go on to public comment. But this is, I believe, a substantially better proposal than, certainly better than the one that I was opposed to previously. I think this would be a good use of that space, and it would benefit the rest of the park and would give us, I think, more certainty about the outcome of this space. Thank you.